Hola chicos, esta semana vamos a estar hablando de la comida, vamos a también estar hablando de verbos irregulares en yo y vamos a hacer los mandatos. Entonces, empezamos. Ok, aquí hay verbos irregulares en yo. Verbos irregulares en yo es una categoría de verbos. Entonces, hay 4 categorías de verbos. Hay regulares, irregulares en yo, irregulares con cambios a la raíz y irregulares. En inglés, estas categorías se llaman, ¿no? Regular, irregular yo, o sometimes also called first person singular irregular verbs, stem changers, and irregulars, ¿no? Los regulares, es decir, que la raíz del verbo no cambia, ¿no? Irregulares en yo, es decir, que la forma yo cambia. Y verbos irregulares con cambios en la raíz, es decir, que la raíz tiene que cambiar antes de conjugar el verbo, ¿no? Entonces tienes que añadirle un paso. Y los irregulares, es decir, que no tienen regla, no tienen pauta, que siguen mientras que se vayan conjugando, ¿no? Ok, es decir, en inglés no vamos a decir, if it's regular, no, that means that the stem will always remain the same. That's to say that the stem doesn't change. So, for example, when we were conjugating hablar, no, we said hablo, hablas, habla, hablamos, no, because the stem didn't change. If we had vivir, right, it was vivo, vives, vive, no, the stem vive would remain the same. So that's what makes it regular, is that the stem is going to remain unchanged. But as we all know, language is dynamic. So that means that languages are always changing. They're always mutating. And the forms that tend to mutate the most often are definitely going to be the forms that are used the most often. This is why, right, irregulars are often tend to be verbs that are used very often, right? Like ser is a completely irregular verb, right? Soy, eres, es. It doesn't seem to follow any type of normal pattern. And that is because, right, it's just one of the verbs that's used the most often. Irregular yo verbs and stem changers are going to function in that same way. They're going to just be used very often. And so this is part of the reason why they tend to be a little bit more dynamic. Now, when we say a verb is irregular in yo, what we mean is, right, that the yo form will, in that verb, will change. That is all that this means, right? All this category means is that all the other forms will remain the same, but the yo form will alter. Sometimes these verbs are also called go verbs because a lot of them have a go at the end of them. So sometimes they do follow that go pattern. Okay. Entonces, es decir que la forma yo de estos verbos siempre va a cambiar. Las otras formas de conjugación, las otras formas no van a cambiar, ¿no? Es solamente la forma yo. Entonces, por ejemplo, si yo tengo hacer, ¿no? Tiene que ser yo hago, pero tú haces, él hace, nosotros hacemos, ellos hacen, ¿no? Todos los demás son regular, ¿no? O si yo tengo salir, ¿no? Yo salgo, pero tú sales, él sale, nosotros salimos, vosotros salís, ellos salen, ¿no? Todas las otras formas son regulares, ¿no? Nota que estos verbos que normalmente son irregulares en yo, normalmente terminan no en er y ere. No es decir que eso es una regla total, pero es algo que pueden ver, ¿no? Okay, so although go verbs, that means that the yo form is going to change, but the other forms are going to remain the same. So if I had hacer, for example, it's yo hago, but tú haces, él hace, nosotros hacemos, vosotros hacéis, ellos hacen, no? But all the other forms are going to remain the same. Here are some other ones that are also fit into that category of go verbs, right? So again, we have to remember that when we have these go verbs, all the other forms are going to remain the same. So let's take salir, for example, right? So it's yo salgo, but tú sales, no? Regular. Él Sale, regular. Nosotros salimos, regular, right? It ends in an IR, so it has to follow the IR patterns, right? Vosotros salís, ¿no? Y ellos salen, ¿no? So all of this remains regular, even though it is an irregular yo verb, right? Because with irregular yo verbs, the only form that changes is always going to be the yo. So always the yo form is going to change, and all the other forms are going to remain the same. So here, right, our yo is different, but then all these other forms are regular. Okay. That is all that this category needs. Okay, so again, right, we have all these kind of go verbs here. And here we can see, right, that the yo form changes, right? That's what this means, right? The yo will be different, but the rest of the verb remains the same. No, yo is different, but the rest of the verb is going to remain regular. The yo changes, but the rest of the verb is going to remain regular. Again, yo is different, right? But the rest of it is going to remain regular. So all of these verbs, right, the yo will be different, but then the rest of the verb will remain regular. Decir is a little bit of an exception to that, as it also is a stem changer. It's a stem changer and it's an irregular yo verb. So I'm not really entirely sure why they put it in this category because I think that's a little confusing, but that's just so that you know. Okay. Now the go verbs though are not the only irregular yo verbs. No, we have things like caigo, right, to fall down, or hago, I make or I do, no, pongo, traigo, oigo, salgo. But we also have some other irregular yo verbs, right? Whenever we learned estar, right, we learned that estar is an irregular yo verb, right? Because we have yo estoy, but tú estás, él está, nosotros estamos, vosotros estáis, ellos están, ¿no? So it's the same with these verbs, right? We have a yo form that is irregular, right? Yo doy, yo sé, yo conozco, yo conduzco, yo parezco, ¿no? Yo traduzco. And these are all verbs that in the first person would change. So, dar is to give, saber is to know, conocer also means to know, but to know different types of things. Conducir is to drive, parecer is to appear, and traducir is to translate. Saber is going to be used whenever we know things that are considered more facts, and conocer is going to be used when we know things that are more experiential, so things that we've experienced, like knowing people, places, or topics, right, that we're very familiar with. Okay. So here are some categories of verbs that have similar irregular yo patterns, right? So we have our go verbs like caigo, pongo, salgo, traigo. And then we have ones that end in a ZCO, right? Conduzco, conozco, obedezco, parezco, produzco, traduzco, right? Those are going to follow a similar pattern. Then we have some other ones that end in a J, right? This is a pronunciation thing generally, right? Because remember, G-O makes a G sound, not a G sound. So we want to continue with that G sound. So yo dirijo, escojo, exijo, protejo, right? So that we have that G sound in there. And then we have some that are slightly more irregular than normal, right? Like quepo, no? Or se o veo. Okay. So again, right here, we have some irregular yo verbs examples, right? The only one that we haven't seen here before is recoger, no, which means to pick up. And that one also has to be an irregular yo for pronunciation. So recojo. Sometimes these verbs are called sombrero verbs, right? Because the first part of it changes. So sometimes they're called sombrero verbs, right? Because the hat part or the lid of the hat or the brim of the hat part changes. So that's just another way of talking about them. Okay, so if we did this activity together, what would be the correct answers? A veces, hacer fiestas los sábados. If we were going to pick the yo form, right, it would have to be hago, no? Or here, if we're going to pick the yo form again, right, it's pongo, ¿no? Yo siempre pongo la televisión a las 8 de la noche. Todos los días yo le traigo, ¿no? Traigo. Y todos los días yo salgo de mi casa para la universidad a las 8 de la mañana. ¿Ok? Ok, muy bien. So now we know a little bit more about irregular yo verbs, and I hope that has helped. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about food. Okay. So now we're talking a little bit about food. Vamos a empezar hablando de la comida, ¿no? Estas diapositivas son un poco como más amplias, ¿no? De lo que hay en el libro, pero nomás es para que sepan, ¿no? Y que tengan un poco más de información sobre lo que puede ser la comida. Y yo también me enfoqué un poco, ¿no? En lo que es más como la comida latinoamericana y la diferencia, ¿no? Entre la comida latinoamericana y la comida estadounidense. No, para que sepan. Okay. Now, food is a very diverse topic, right? Because depending on the country that you go to, the words for food might be a little bit different. So this is something to kind of remember when we're thinking about food, right? That the words might look slightly different based on the country that you go to. For example, when I lived in Argentina, right? Durazno meant peach, right? And melocotón, no, it's the other way. Melocotón meant peach and durazno meant nectarine. But in Costa Rica, where my family is from, melocotón and durazno are interchangeable, right? They both mean peach. So that's one thing, right? Or like, for example, in Argentina, right? Pochoclo is the word for popcorn. And I said to someone, oh, I want some palomitas de maíz. And they were like, what is a palomita de maíz? But, you know, in Costa Rica, where my family is from, palomitas de maíz is how you say popcorn, you know? So, you know, things like that are important to remember when we're thinking about food, that these are not the only words that can be used with food. Food is also very cultural. And so there may be other words when we talk about these foods based on the country that you're in. And so you just have to kind of go with it, right? So it's not the only words, but these are some words that are used in relationship to foods. Okay. Okay. Las comidas pueden ser o la comida que comemos o es decir, los platos que comemos cada día, es decir, cuando nos sentamos a comer esa comida, ¿no? Por ejemplo, una comida puede ser como el desayuno, el almuerzo o la cena, o también puede ser la comida en sí que estamos comiendo. Tiene dos significados, ¿no? So food or comida has two meanings in Spanish. It can mean meal, like what we eat, like desayuno, almuerzo, and cena. Or it can also mean comida, like the actual food we are eating. No, so it means both things. In Spanish, desayunar, almorzar, and cenar are verbs. So we don't say in Spanish, I eat breakfast per se. I mean, we can say that if we wanted to, but generally they're verbs. So you're going to use them as verbs, right? So when you want to say, I eat breakfast, you would say desayuno, right? I eat breakfast because it's a verb. To eat breakfast is a verb. Or if you wanted to say, I ate lunch, you know, or I'm eating lunch, almuerzo, no? Or ceno, I ate dinner. No, I'm eating dinner. So they're verbs on top of also being the words for meals. So in generally, when you're writing your assignments, right, you might want to write something like como el almuerzo, but it would be more common to just say almuerzo, rather than to say como el almuerzo. It sounds a little, I don't know, something. It sounds a little chunky, like too many words, because you don't really need that many words. So you just say almuerzo, right? I ate lunch. I eat lunch. Okay. El desayuno, ¿no? Es la primera comida del día. In all the Spanish-speaking countries I have been to, breakfast is very different from what we eat in the United States. So we're going to look first at el desayuno típico estadounidense, and then we'll look at el desayuno de países latinoamericanos, ¿no? Ok. En los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Comemos huevos o se pueden comer revueltos o fritos, ¿no? Revueltos is obvio. No, it's obvious what revuelto means. The sausage in here is chorizo. It's not chorizo. It's not just any kind of regular sausage. It's a particular type of sausage that has a special kind of spice about it. And huevo frito, no, it's obvious what huevo frito means. In an American breakfast, right, you're going to have things like salchicha. You're going to have tocino. You're probably also going to have pan, no, tostadas de pan. You might also put mantequilla on your pan or mermelada. Sometimes mermelada is also called jalea, although jalea might just be jelly, and as opposed to like jam, right? So, and the difference between jelly and jam is that one has fruit in it and the other one doesn't, right? So jelly has no fruit and jam has fruit in it. So mermelada is more like jam and jalea is more like jelly. There's also another word that can be used for mantequilla, which is manteca. But manteca, in my experience, is used more for margarine rather than butter. But I have also heard people call manteca butter. So that's another word that can also be used. Ok, también se puede comer queso en el desayuno, ¿no? Queso, cheese in Spanish-speaking countries is very different from the type of cheese that I've had here in the United States. Cheese generally tends to be a little bit more, well, at least in Costa Rica, where my family is from, queso blanco tends to be a very common type of cheese, particularly at breakfast and things like that. Queso blanco is, it's not, you would slice it, but it's also a little bit squishy. So it doesn't have it's got a bit of an in-between texture between like cream cheese and like regular cheese, because it is a little bit spreadable, more like brie, but it's not quite that squishy. I don't eat cheese, so I'm not, I just see people eat cheese, so I'm not entirely sure. The other things that are not as common, right? The Americans love mozzarella, and mozzarella is a very Italian type of cheese. Most places, like in Europe, for example, if they're going to eat mozzarella, they boil the mozzarella before they cut it up into slices. So it's not as common for a lot of people. If they're going to eat like pizza or something like that, they're going to eat, they might eat mozzarella, but they also might eat another type of cheese that's really common for pizza, which in Europe, which is Emmentaler, which has a little bit of a different taste to it. Okay. Ok, en los Estados Unidos también se puede comer cereal con leche. So cereal and milk, right? Now I only ate cereal in Argentina. I've never eaten it for breakfast in any other context in any of the other countries in Latin America that I've been to. But I really only think that at the school that I went to, they only served us cereal because it was like one of the cheapest things you can get in mass for breakfast. But when we would eat cereal in Argentina, first they would give us a bowl, and then they would pour coffee in the bowl, and then they would pour milk, but not generally the more common type of milk, especially for something like where you're going to serve hundreds of people, like in the context of this school, is the milk that you don't refrigerate. So they're in in a lot of Latin American countries where I've been to, there are kind of two types of milk, right? There's a type of milk that spoils very quickly, but is more fresh. And then there's another type of milk that is you get on a shelf and that you don't have to refrigerate. You can just leave it out. Powdered milk is also common in Latin American countries. But the milk that we have, which is like in between all of those milks, like you have to refrigerate it, but it does expire at a certain point, is not, or isn't as common in the places that I have been. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen, but I personally haven't seen it. And so because there were so many of us, they would serve us that milk that doesn't expire. You just, you can sit on the shelf for ages. And then they would put the cereal over that. So in a bowl with coffee and milk, and then they would put something that was like Frosted Flakes, but didn't have any sugar in it over that. It was very interesting. And I asked one time if I could just have milk for my cereal, and they said no. And they said it was very strange that I would ask that. Why would I ask for milk for my cereal? Because it's very wasteful and I would just waste too much milk. So I never got that. But where I was at, they did eat cereal, but I think sometimes it was just because it was very cheap. And when I went to the grocery store and I looked in the cereal aisle in this supermarket, and it was in a backwoods in Argentina, but kind of it was a very small town. And by small town, I mean, it only had one square. So in this very small town in Argentina, they only had two types of cereal. They had Frosted Flakes with no sugar on it. And then they had like a form of Raisin Bran that also had no sugar in it. And that was it. There was no other types of cereal. So I've never had cereal in Costa Rica. Any of the times I've gone to go visit my family, it just was not as common. In Venezuela or in Chile and Paraguay, Uruguay, I've never had cereal in any of those places. So I don't think that it's much of a common breakfast food in Latin America. And when I went to the Dominican Republic, there was a breakfast buffet, but cereal was not one of the items that was offered on the breakfast buffet. So I think maybe it's just not very common as a breakfast food. Okay. Another thing that is a very American type of food is bagels. Una rosquilla con queso de crema, no, and cream cheese, right? It is a very American type of food. It has a lot of bread in it. And so that's another food that I just I've not seen in a lot of other countries, or seen at all, actually, unless it's in like an American aisle where it's being served as an American food. Okay. In most of the Spanish-speaking countries that I have been to, although of course I am not speaking exclusively for all Spanish-speaking countries, but in most of the Spanish-speaking countries I have been to, a desayuno típico is just eggs, rice, sometimes beans, and plátano maduro. Or sometimes they just serve fresh fruit and some egg and a tortilla. I've had that also. Or in Argentina, other than cereal, the other thing that they just gave us was bread and butter. So that was another option for breakfast. I've seen that. But in Costa Rica, where my family is from, the most common type of breakfast is this, right? We're going to have gallo pinto, which is a form of rice and beans together. We're going to have egg in it. And then we might have a little plátano maduro from the day before, leftover from the day before. In Venezuela, when I went to go visit, we had arepas for breakfast. Arepa is, I know it looks like an English muffin, but it's not. It is a type of bread that is made with cornmeal. And so it has a little bit more of a grainy texture to it. And the inside is very soft, so very cornmealy. And then the outside is very hard. So arepas can be made a couple of different ways. You can pan fry them and then bake them, or you can deep fry them, just kind of depends. But they have a lot of stuff in them, right? So you can make them, I've seen them two ways. I've seen them sweet, or I've seen them salty. You can put sweets in them, or you can also put Salties like ham and cheese, or ham and cheese and egg, or things like this, right? Gallo pinto is a very common dish in Costa Rica. In fact, it is the national dish of Costa Rica. And basically, in order to make gallo pinto, you have to, and actually, I've even seen it spelled more than one way, which is really interesting. But gallo pinto can also be spelled like this, which is also really interesting. Or I've also seen it spelled like this, like all one word. So that's another thing that is kind of interesting about it. But gallo pinto is made with, generally it is made with the rice and beans from the day before. And it really has to be made, it really has to be rice and beans from the day before. You shouldn't make it with fresh rice or beans. But you mix the rice and beans from the day before together, and then you crack an egg into it. And that's gallo pinto, really. It's a very popular dish. It's basically the only thing that I ate for breakfast in Costa Rica whenever I was going there growing up. But I've also had it in lots of other places in Latin America. So it is something I think that people eat for breakfast in other places. In España, when I went to go visit Spain, I had una tortilla for breakfast. And it's not like a tortilla like what we think about as a tortilla, right? Which is made with corn flour or made with, or cornmeal, or it's made with, made with corn flour, or made with, like regular flour. It's not like that, right? That kind of tortilla. As you can tell, I don't cook. So I know kind of what goes into things, but I don't make anything. But this tortilla is a very common dish in Spain, so common that every home comes equipped almost with a special frying pan that just makes these tortillas. It's just so interesting. I went to a couple of different homes in Spain, and they all had it's like double frying pans that make these tortillas, which is basically you whip some eggs together. You have some already cooked potatoes, maybe left over from the day before or something, and you put them in this like deep frying pan. And then you have another frying pan that goes on top, and it has a lock and it closes. And then you cook it for about, I think it was maybe like less than 10 minutes. And then you flip it over to the other side and let it cook for, 5 or 10 minutes on the other side. When you unlock it, you open it because it opens both ways, right? And it's done. And then you cut it up into slices, and everybody has a little bit for breakfast. It was really interesting. Ok. Claro que en el desayuno se toma café, ¿no? Coffee is really common in Spanish-speaking countries, but generally it is not the kind of coffee that we have here in the United States. If you ask for just a coffee, what they're going to generally probably serve you is an espresso. If you ask for café con leche, then you're going to get more of what we think of as coffee, but the milk is going to generally be steamed. Té or té caliente is a very popular drink over there in a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, but the types of tea that are had in Spanish-speaking countries tend to be different. Té de manzanilla, which is just chamomile tea, is very popular. Té de manzana, or like apple teas, are also very common. So they tend to drink more like herbal or fruity teas rather than like black teas. Jugos are also very common, right? Jugo de naranja. If you want to have a different type of jugo, you're just going to switch out naranja for another word, right? So jugo de piña, jugo de naranja, jugo de manzana, jugo de limón, no? So you just switch out the word for another word. Ok, en el almuerzo, no, esa es la segunda comida del día. En los Estados Unidos típicamente se coma un sándwich. Ok, los sándwiches pueden ser o de atún, de jamón, de roast beef, de pavo, de pollo. No, there are many types of sandwiches that we eat here in the US, right? We've got tuna, ham, roast beef, turkey, chicken. I'm not saying that they don't eat sandwiches in Spanish-speaking countries, but I've personally never had one. Not in the way that we, like with sliced bread, and that, that's not super common. I have had something called a bocadillo, which bocadillo it's like a sandwich, but it's it's not quite, it's made with different types of bread and it's not quite the same. But that would be like the most, kind of one-to-one for a sandwich, I think, in a Spanish speaking country. Okay. Una hamburguesa con papas fritas. It may surprise you to know that hamburgers are a very American food. And they are very difficult to find unless in other countries. And it's, I was able to find hamburgers at McDonald's, which, McDonald's happens in a lot of other places, but I never was able to find it if it wasn't like at a Tex-Mex restaurant or like an American restaurant. It's just not something that people eat. Papas fritas, on the other hand, is much more common. Okay, una ración de pizza, una porción de pizza. Okay, en un país hispano, el almuerzo es una comida normal. No, so you don't eat anything special at lunch. Normally you're just going to eat normal foods. You might eat empanadas, right? The empanada is something really good because it's quick and you can take it fast. Empanadas come from 2 countries, but they're eaten in a lot of countries. So this is not exclusive, but you can have them, empanadas chilenas and empanadas venezolanas, and they're a little bit different. The empanadas venezolanas that I had personally were made with like flaky pastry like this. And empanadas come either salty or they can come sweet sometimes too. In Chile, the empanada that I had was made with like a type of mashed potato on the outside, or that's what it felt like. It wasn't mashed potato, but it was like squishy potato on the outside, and it was deep fried and it had meat on the inside. So it looked like an empanada, but it was made with potato, which was really interesting, and very good. It's really good, but it's just crunchy on the outside, right, but soft on the inside. And those didn't come sweet; they just came salty. But that was the type of empanada I had in Chile. También se puede comer caldo de res, ¿no? Que es una sopa, ¿no? O galletas saladas, como estas. No se come mucho pan, pero sí se come mucha tortilla. Tortilla is not just a Mexican food, although I think it started in Mexico. It is a food that is eaten by tons of people in Central and South America. It is very, very popular. And that may be because you can make a lot of it at a very low, at a very low cost point. You need very little other than just the mix and like salt and water. But normally you also need like an empanada, you need this, or a tortilla, like a flattener, right? I don't know what that little machine is called, but you have to have this little machine where you flatten the tortilla so they're the right consistency. And you want to make sure also with tortillas, my understanding, I don't personally make them, but I've asked, and they cannot be too moist because they'll stick to the pan, and they also the masa can't be too dry. If it's too dry, it won't puff up the way they're supposed to. So when they make the tortilla, in order to know that it's cooked all the way through, it's going to puff up, as it cooks. So, which is really interesting. Okay. Para la merienda, se puede comer papitas o se puede comer una fruta, ¿no? Como una manzana, una pera, o uvas o un banano. There's, of course, a difference between a plátano and a banano. Having eaten a plátano when it was not ripe, they do not taste like a banano. Okay, so bananos, right, you want to eat them when they're yellow, right? But a plátano, you want to eat it's larger, and you either want to eat it when it's green or when it's so ripe it's brown, and you don't want to eat it when it's yellow, right? So that's the big difference between a plátano and a banana. Un durazno, un melocotón, fresas, no, o frambuesas. These are more type of American type fruits, right? Because they're forest fruits. And so in a lot of Spanish speaking countries, you're going to get more tropical fruits, although not exclusively. Moras, no, arándano. Piña Piña is very common in most of the Spanish-speaking countries I've been to. Piña is a very popular fruit. Cerezas, naranja o melón. Melón is also popular. Toronja, o a veces también se dice pomelo o sandilla. Another kind of fruit that's really popular is papaya, right? And then they have all sorts of really like nice tropical fruits in places like that. And one of my favorites was manzana de agua, which I've only ever had in Costa Rica, and it looked like a red pear, but when you bit into it, it was so juicy. But the reason why we don't get those fruits here in the United States is because they in order for something to be shipped, right, it has to be able to be transportable in a cooler. And most of those tropical fruits, you have to harvest them once they're ready, and their maturity rate is going to expire before they reach anywhere. So a lot of tropical fruits, right, we just don't get them here because they would go bad before they could even arrive here. Another one that is very popular is like mango, right? Or carambola, right? Carambola star fruit, things like that. Ok, también tenemos limón y limón verde. Ok, estas son algunas verduras, ¿no? O a veces también se dice vegetales, ¿no? Como guisantes, o en Costa Rica se dicen petipoa, ¿no? Judías verdes, o también en Costa Rica se dicen habichuelas. O he escuchado también frijol, ¿no? Frijol is another word that you might use for habichuela. Apio, ajo, zanahoria, tomate, lechuga, repollo. Now in Central America and also in a lot of other places, repollo is a much more common vegetable than lechuga. In my experience, repollo is used more often than things like lechuga. Lechuga is more like thing that we would eat just on a salad, right? But repollo is used for lots of things, right? So in Costa Rica, you use repollo, you would have like a repollo salad to put on tacos and things like that. You would use repollo for that instead of using lechuga. Okay, chile dulce, o a veces se dice pimiento, not to be confused with pimienta, right? Pimienta is salt, or excuse me, it means pepper, right? Pepper like the spice, right? So we have sal y pimienta, right? Salt and pepper, but pimiento is the vegetable, no? O maíz. Maíz is sometimes called choclo in other countries, or there are other words that are used for maíz, but you know, maíz is common. Vegetables that are more common in Spanish language culture food are things like yuca, no, and chayote. Yuca is a root vegetable, and it's used kind of similar to how people might use a potato. And chayote is, in English, we call it vegetable pear, but it's used in the same way that we might use squash. Y una cebolla. Ok, también tenemos dulces y galletas, ¿no? Y para la cena, ¿no? Es la última comida del día. Esta es una paella, ¿no? Paella is a Spanish, as in from Spain, right? It's a Spanish dish. Ok. Tenemos un aperitivo o entremeses, como una sopa, una ensalada. Para el plato principal, ¿no? Se puede comer chuletas, ¿no? Estas chuletas de cerdo, arroz de frijoles, pechuga de pollo, mariscos. Mariscos is just the word for like mussels. Langosta, camarones, bistec, y aquí también tenemos una papa al horno, y pescado. This is, when I've ordered fish in Spanish-speaking countries, it comes like this, right? It comes the whole fish with the head. And this is because in Spanish-speaking countries, people want to eat the stuff that comes on the head, right? They want to eat like the eyes and the brains and stuff that come in it. And not always, but my mom says it's the best part. Ok. Para beber, ¿no? O para una bebida, se puede tomar té helado, agua. And in Spanish-speaking countries, right, we have agua con gas o agua sin gas o agua gaseosa o agua mineral, no? So those kind of mean the same thing, right? Sparkling water, or we have flat water. Se puede comer vino, vino tinto, rosado o blanco, cerveza. Something that is common in Argentina where I was lived was yerba mate, which is like a type of tea. It's a hot tea. And that it's very, very common over there. Everybody drinks it. And it's so common that you'll find it in places like Uruguay and Paraguay, which are just right next door to Argentina. And in Paraguay, they also really love to drink it cold. And so, but when they drink it cold, they tend to call it tereré. Okay, también tenemos muchos pasteles o postres. Pastel is often just a word for cake, but it can also mean like pastry. And postre is a word that we use for dessert. Okay, ¿cómo? Arroz con leche, ¿no? Tres leches, flan, helado, y en Argentina se come facturas. ¿Ok? Ok, y finalmente vamos a hacer mandatos, ¿no? Mandatos. ¿Qué es un mandato? Un mandato en inglés se llama commands, ¿no? Es cuando una persona manda a otra persona a hacer algo, ¿no? Se usan los mandatos en la tercera persona o singular o plural, ¿no? Como por ejemplo, si tu mamá quiere que pase la aspiradora, ¿no? Ella te va a decir, pasa la aspiradora, ¿no? O si tu mamá quiere que tú sacas la basura, ¿no? Ella te va a decir, saca la basura. O él quiere que riegas las plantas, ¿no? Entonces va a decir, riega las plantas. O si tu papá quiere que cortas el césped, ¿no? Te va a decir, corta el césped. Tu jefe quiere que tú laves tus platos, ¿no? Él te va a decir, lava los platos. O si él quiere que tú plantas la ropa antes de llegar a trabajar, ¿no? Te va a decir, plancha tu ropa. Hay algunos irregulares, ¿no? Como por ejemplo, si tu mamá quiere que tú tienes que hacer tu cama, ¿no? Que hagas tu cama, entonces ella te va a decir, haz tu cama, ¿no? Oh, hay un error ahí. Espera. Perdón, había un error. Ok, tu mamá quiere que haces tu cama, ¿no? Ella te va a decir, haz tu cama. Ok, si tu papá quiere que tengas éxito en tu examen mañana, ¿no? Él te va a decir, ten éxito. Oh, no, tu jefe quiere que seas simpático con los clientes, ¿no? Él te va a decir, sé bueno con los clientes. Ok. Fin. So that is the mandatos, no? It's just a brief. And that is all the things that we had for now. Okay, so manos a la obra, chicos. Y que tengan una buena semana, ¿no? Y que les vaya bien en todo lo que hagan, ¿no? Ok, chao.